Very good. All right. Welcome, everybody, to 52 Living Ideas. I'm just delighted that Roger, Claire, and Victor are doing Maps of Meaning. This is the first book of Jordan Peterson that I got into, and it is the deepest work that he has done. So this is wonderful. And I was completely blown away by how these guys started the introduction. So I'm really looking forward to it. So take it away, folks.
All right, guys. Thank you very much. If you'd like to bear with me for a sec, since Victor last time dazzled me with an amazing slideshow, I decided to make my own. So give me 1 second. All right. Can everyone see this? Yes, perfect. So today, let me move this in case you can. So today we're actually going to be talking about the Maps of Meaning TVO number 2, which is essentially entitled Religion and Psychology. If you guys remember from our last lecture, the main discussion of that was essentially talking about myth and what myth means to man and why we create myths. So real quick, before we get started, I do want to kind of frame what we're going to be talking about and what the goals are for today. The first goal is we want to try to explain the concepts of order and chaos in the psychological sense, as well as the symbolic examples that you often see in myths. The main reason for this is these are some of the main concepts that Peterson constantly uses to explain one, mythological interpretations, but also psychological makeup of the human mind and how we actually conceptualize things. The second goal is going to be to provide examples of order and chaos in these classical myths, so you can actually start to see and pick up the pattern. And then finally, bringing it more concrete, how these concepts start to then map on to more practical ideas, such as the concept of authority or the concept of a government and a state. And the main way to really think of myths, or the main way that for me really helps me conceptualize how to think of myths, is one of my favorite quotes from Joseph Campbell, which is essentially, mythology is psychology misread as theology. And it's the idea that the myths that we have can be read much better as an interpretation of our internal selves rather than the description of the external world. So for those who may have missed it, or if you don't remember because it was 2 weeks ago, these are just some of the presuppositions that we're kind of borrowing from the last lecture. The first is that there's actually 2 forms of truth, right? There's the scientific truth, which I think we all know is the general sense of facts, verifiable, confirmed. And then there's the practical or affective truths. And Peterson tends to sometimes distinguish these things as saying, one is, if you conceptualize the world as a place of things, dead things, then you're considering it from a scientific perspective. Everything is just things, items. However, if you conceptualize the world as a place of action, where you need to first act, you can't use any of the science to help you make those decisions, because those are value judgments. But nevertheless, that's a truth that you need. You need to be able to understand that aspect of life too. So it's a very different form of truth. So that's kind of the first presupposition that we're starting with. The second one is that religious thinking is an attempt to capture human experience rather than the rational material world. So starting from there, for anyone who's read the book, this might seem not nearly as in-depth as the book is. For anyone who hasn't read the book, this might seem very, very complicated very quickly. So bear with me, there's going to be a big difference.
Roger, This is a good time to find out how many people are reading the book. So
yes.
If you are reading the books, just open your participants panel and just click on yes. If you're reading the book, just go ahead and click on yes. So we have a sense of who is reading the book. Okay, and just keep on going. This is a book, Maps of Meaning. All right, go on, Roger.
Perfect. So the next question, if we'd really, remembering from last one, if we remember that myths aren't just made up stories, if they actually do serve a more complex purpose, if maybe they served a more complex purpose that science therefore can't replace, how can we then try to better understand, or what lens can we use to kind of get the information that those myths were trying to convey, to get it more articulated, to get more concrete, so we can actually understand what it is? Two big tools that Peterson uses is the concept of chaos and order. And specifically, since he is a clinical psychologist, this idea he first encounters in psychology. However, you will quickly find that it relates to just about everything, because it's actually how we understand the world and how we come up with our own beliefs. And that is why Maps of Meaning, the subtitle of Maps of Meaning is the architecture of belief, is because that's actually how we conceptualize the world. So here we go. The first thing we're going to be talking about is the psychological affect of order. In other words, what does order make you feel? Because again, we are in a subjective realm. However, it's a subjective realm that we all seem to share, and that is very common to all of us. When you are in order, you are in a realm that's safe, predictable, understood. And the best way to understand this is that we're essentially animals that had to evolve. We didn't just appear this way. And to evolve, we had to be able to detect threat, or more importantly, and more specifically, anomaly, anything that was off, anything that seemed wrong. But if we want to have that ability, in order to have that ability, we need to first have a norm or a map or something that is what's expected, in order for the anomaly to be something that's not that, right? If we don't have something that's expected first, then anything that happens is just another event. There's no expectation or non-expectation. So anytime you understand or feel like you understand the world around you, like for example, right now, you are in a place of order. You're in a place where you believe that you understand your surroundings well enough that you can sit here and look at a guy that lives in DC talk about this book that's 20 years old, right? You feel like, yeah, I don't need to be doing anything insane. I don't need to be like barring the doors. I don't need to be getting my weapons ready. This is where we constantly are trying to be at. We are constantly wanting to be in a location like this. And for obvious reasons, it keeps us safe. It keeps us comfortable. It allows us to do what we want to do in a predictable way. And Peterson represents this as the domain and constituent elements of the known. So this is his little drawing that he has, is the what is. Can you guys see this mouse?
Yep.
All right. So he has the what is, which is essentially your current theory of where you currently are. And then he also has what should be, which means that anytime you want any action, anytime you do anything at all, it requires that you first conceptualize it. You can't act without first understanding what it is you're trying to act. And it means that you make a value judgment that naturally states, well, if I did that, things would be better in some way. And it doesn't necessarily mean the better here is very flexible, right? If I want to punch someone in the face, it might still be better for me, but that person's not going to appreciate it. But either way, the idea is there's a situation I want to happen, and then there's a situation where I am. And then in the middle, in between that, there's how do I get from point A to point B? Now, as long as all three of those parts act the way they should, we're good. That is actually how we regulate our mood. That's what regulates our feelings of stress, our feelings of happiness, especially when we have a sense that we are moving towards that goal. So essentially, this is a picture of a very, very simplified picture of what our motivative narrative is when everything's going according to plan. And before I move on, Claire, do you have anything that you'd like to?
No, I think what might be helpful here is what does this look like in real life? Right. I mean, the example that kind of comes into my head is, okay, we all need to eat, right? So we know what is now. We know that we need to put food on the table for today. We're going to go out grocery shopping, or we're going to go out to achieve whatever that aim is. And along the way, all sorts of things are going to happen. We know that there'll be a checker. We know the route to get to the grocery store. We know we have our list. There's all sorts of these kind of shoulds that we interact with. And then occasionally there's the one that we don't expect, right? You get in a car accident on the way to the grocery store, or something kind of flies into your face that crosses you off as you're heading toward where you are. Or even your bathroom example, I thought was a good one, Roger.
Right. Yeah. And that's what I was going to jump into next. Is a good example of just how good you have down your order is that, and I hope I'm not the only one that does this, that you can wake up in the middle of the night and walk all the way to your bathroom with all the lights off until you're in the bathroom and turn on the light, right? And you can do it even if you've left things around. You'll actually normally remember different things and you'll navigate around them. Or if you hit them, you'll be like, oh, it must have been that thing. And so again, we're very capable of mapping our entire surroundings, but naturally that's not how life actually works, because there's constantly anomaly. There's constantly things we can't account for or didn't account for or didn't know that we should have accounted for. So in this same example, imagine that you're getting up, it's 2 a.m., you walk to your bathroom, you know your way there, you get to the bathroom, and then you hear a plate crash behind you. What's the reaction, right? The reaction is not the same state or calmness that you had. Suddenly you are, you're scared, you jump. You might even calm down after you realize it's just a plate. Now, twist it even more. What if you hear someone talking in the room behind you? Now it's not just a plate that you can just simplify. Now it's, I have no idea what that is. That shouldn't even exist, right? According to my own understanding of the world, that shouldn't exist at all. So that means that my understanding of the world is completely wrong. And I don't know how far down. I don't know where I went wrong. I just know that the fact that this thing's here means it's wrong. And that is how you get to the next step, which is the psychological affect of chaos, which is the part we don't like. It's where things are dangerous, where things are constantly novel. It is actually the source of all things, both good and bad. And you can think of it as almost everything in your life, likely everything in your life, has come from a place that at first was unknown at some point, right? At some point it had to be unknown before it was attained. And that's kind of just the rules of the game that we're playing as humans. That there's a limitation to our capacity to understand the world. Past that limitation, we can't even conceptualize what's there, right? And that's why mythologically we understand it as chaos, as it has no order, it's completely random. Well, it doesn't, not necessarily, just more that we don't have the capacity to understand it at all. And this is also why Peterson makes the point of the affective valence of chaos. And all that those fancy words mean is you can't help but pay attention to it. And in the case of both the plate or people talking, or if just right now suddenly someone whispered behind you, before you even processed the thought, your eyes would orient to it. Mm-hmm. And that's the orientation reflex. That's the idea that anything that's anomalous, anything that breaks this original first circle, immediately, before you can process it, demands your attention. It's an instinct, right? Immediately, it's a way to look at that. Now, why does all this matter? Well, it matters because when this goes wrong and we get very upset, it might make it so that this model of the world is no longer valid. And now we're in trouble because now you don't know what to do. So this is the problem of what do you do when you don't know what to do? And for Peterson, a really good example he constantly uses, and that I think is probably a really solid one, is if imagine you've been married for 15 years and you find out that your wife has been having an affair for the past 10, right? At that moment, when that realization fully hits, and it might take, as it's been pointed out, it might take months for that to fully hit, right? And a lot of times there's denial and other obstacles that we do because we really want to cling on to this idea of what we think we believe. The past 10 years, who she was, and even probably further behind that, who she was has now completely changed. You thought she was someone that she obviously wasn't. And you just didn't account for how complex this thing was. But then more importantly, you also didn't account for who you were. You thought you were smart enough to know that. You thought you were the type of person who would be able to see this, and you're not. So then that also determines that not only are you not where you think you are, you're not even heading where you think you are. Because apart from the fact that now you're in a relationship that is not what you understand at all, you're also not someone who's capable of discerning how relationships move by the fact that you're wrong. So now you're in a really big problem. You don't know what your future looks like. You don't know what your past looks like. And you currently don't know where you're at. So now, and this is, Peterson often describes this as everyone is full of snakes, right? You see the predatory nature of the entire world, and it paralyzes us. And the reason this is all important psychologically is this is a lot of times where people get ruined. There's a lot of times where people can't get out of the chaos. They get stuck there. Everyone knows someone or is someone who's gone through a bad divorce that they can never recover from. Like studies have shown that once you go through a divorce, you almost never can reach the same level of happiness, self-reported happiness, as prior to that first divorce, right? It really destroys us to destroy our full map of what we understand. And yet in these myths, there's this constant story of the way through a bunch of different iterations, this way of being that can transcend death and that allows us to, that is the divine path. Now, you can take the divine path as the path that God wants you to take, which is a pretty simplistic view, or rather a divine path as in the way, the correct way, the holy way, the right things to do things. And like, you don't have to think of it holy in the sense of it's holy because of God, but holy because that's the correct way to do things. And Peterson makes this diagram here, the figure 2, which is the meta-mythological cycle of the way, as basically encompassing that, right? You are in known territory, you're in order, you're doing your little thing, you're going on a date with your wife, and then, you know, she gets a call from her lover that's, you know, mad, and that's the anomalous information creeps in from chaos. As it comes in, it invalidates this map, it invalidates the story. As a result of that invalidation, there's a descent, and it disintegrates the map. Your values no longer matter. Now, many people get stuck here, and what the way tends to normally show, and we're going to talk about 2 different stories that try to show an example of this, is a reintegration and an ascent to a novel way of being. And that novel way of being often also requires 1, a sacrifice of what is most valued, and then 2, a reordering of the hierarchical values. All that means, fancy way of saying, when the thing that you value most, there's times in human life when the thing that you value most is not the correct thing to value. So for example, if you valued your wife more than anything, and then you find out that she's cheating for 10 years, maybe you should reconsider what you care most about. But it's not so easy as to just do that. When you get rid of that, there's true pain, there's true loss, because that's actually how you understand the real world around you. And to find a new one is a pretty difficult thing to do. So how then now that you have the general pattern and general structure, which I know it's a little bit abstract, I just kind of want to point out what order represents, what chaos represents, and this transition, because that's what we're going to be then looking for in these myths that we're about to talk about. All right. And Claire, do you want to jump in with anything else?
No, I think you've laid this out beautifully. I mean, the example that was coming to my mind, it's just so relevant, is this year, right? And the kind of black swan event that has been the pandemic. And, you know, before you know a black swan exists, you never think it exists. And then you see a black swan and it's like, oh my gosh, you know, it stands out so significantly and has the power to destroy your understanding of what you do for a living and the economy and where you live, and just everything falls apart. And the process of kind of rectifying that, and we'll go into this and what the way really looks like, is parsing apart each element of that, speaking truth to power, and really sort of putting it back together.
And yeah, you just reminded me of a really important part. So in the same way that this is how we process the world, right? We constantly are creating order. We interact with chaos to bring chaos into order, and sometimes to bring order into chaos. We are, after all, complex creatures. But this isn't just isolated to an individual perspective. This is also how groups, societies, and states function. Just because you put a bunch of people together and you gave them a bunch of resources and tools doesn't necessitate you got rid of the limitation. The limitation is exactly the same. It might be expanded, but you still have the exact same limitation. We can't process the entire reality, and we can't fully understand our entire surroundings, and we don't fully understand all the causal relationships that are around us. So therefore, like Claire just said, when the pandemic happened, most of us like, whatever, they got another SARS thing going on, whatever. And then slowly creeps more and more and more. And it's like, all right, well, we'll all be sick for like a little flu. And slowly, we still to this day do not understand the consequence. We don't even know what it does to us, right? And there's that constant fear of the unknown that comes up in the same way. But so moving on now, we're going to be talking about Genesis. And Claire, would you like to introduce us to the story real quick?
I would love to. This is going to be a story none of you guys are familiar with whatsoever. The Genesis creation narrative is made up mostly of two stories. Peterson refers to the sort of myth of Genesis. And when he says myth, he's referring to sort of a form of knowledge that's narrative in structure. And so that these truths, they aren't empirical, but rather they describe this kind of process of transformation that Roger's referring to. And the fundamental kind of two structures of this story are the word of God, or order, and chaos, which is used by the word teom. So in the first stories, and we're going to go through kind of both of these briefly, God creates the heavens and the earth in 6 days. He rests and blesses and sanctifies on the seventh. And then in the second story, God creates Adam, the first man. He creates him from dust, and he places him in the Garden of Eden, where Adam is given dominion over the animals. And Eve, the first woman, is created from Adam and acts as his companion. So I'm going to go into Genesis 1, but anything, Roger, you want to frame up before I do?
Just that God, the interesting part about the first start is that God uses, or it's not necessarily God himself, but God speaking, which is the strangest part, right? Like if it's God, why does he got to say anything to literally no one, because no one else exists? But he speaks the world into existence. And that's the speaking aspect is the part that is always associated with the logos, because it's essentially the word of God.
Yeah, absolutely. So it starts out in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. So water is significant here. It's going to come up again in our second myth. And what this really signifies is kind of a pre-consciousness state. So water being this life-giving force, our bodies are mostly made of water. And in this way, water is signifying that sort of that matrix, that chaos from which everything else comes. And from here, God is going to separate the light from the darkness, and God calls the light day, and the darkness he calls light. And so in this way, this first word and this importance of God calling, or God using his speech, is that God is using the word, he's using the logos to extract habitable order out of that chaos, out of that lack of consciousness. God says, let there be light. And in this way, it's not God saying, let there be light. It's the logos. It's really humanity and human consciousness. And there's a Christ parallel here too, that Christ, being the Son of God, being made from God, is the force that God uses to speak habitable order into being. And in this way, the logos and the chaos, they must be intertwined, because if there was no consciousness, how could you say that anything would be real? Reality really wouldn't exist. And so in this, early part of the Bible, we're starting to see this codependency between order and chaos. And it's really this combination that starts to bring order into being. So this logos that operates in human beings is really identical to that which God is making the cosmos out of. Human beings are identified with the logos. They're then made in God's image. And that's really what humans do, right? We encounter sort of this formless potential, and we use our consciousness to give it form. And in this way, there's kind of that father structure, and there's the son, and it's the speaking of the son, the word of the son, that turns that chaos into order. So it is particularly important here that God said, right? That word said is hugely important. And we're going to see this later in Genesis 2, when God gives Adam the job of naming the animals, right? So it's like the animals didn't actually exist until they are given a name. And this again is another indication that the authors of the Bible are really holding up our cognitive faculties and our ability to speak something into truth and out of chaos and into actuality. We can't really, as humans, get a grip on something until we have a name for it. And that's why we all have names. So as soon as you name something, its nature changes, right? We've transformed it into something that isn't just mere potential. It's not just down here, but it's on its way to actuality. It's on its way to being a tool. And in this way, this emphasis on consciousness, on articulation, and on speech is really paramount in the first part of this story. So God identifies the individual with the logos, and it's that very thing that man is made of, right? And God makes Adam out of his own image. From this, we get the concept of natural rights, right? That within all humans is some godliness, some form of sort of purity, and certainly you could. Peterson says you could say that that's superstition, right? This is just sort of religious hoity-toity, archaic ideas. But then if you're doing that, you're throwing away the concept of natural rights altogether. And we know that we all mostly behave as if we believe in that notion of natural rights, and the notion that really every single human being has something divine in them. This plays an integral role in the way we create habitable order out of chaos. And it sits the basis of our legal system. It's the basis of our culture. We see here how this kind of archetypal Adam and Eve, they live in a well, I'll get into that later once we move into the second part of it, which I think is where we're headed. But Genesis 1, God speaks consciousness into being. He creates Adam out of his own image. And then we move into kind of Genesis 2, where everything starts to fall apart. So the second part of the Genesis creation narrative, God creates the first man. He places the first man in a walled garden that he planted eastward of Eden. And out of the ground, the Lord God grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for the food, the tree of life, and also in the midst of the garden, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So man and Adam was free to eat from any tree in the garden except the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And then last of all, just to throw it all in, God also made a woman, Eve, out of the rib of the man to be a companion from him. And in chapter 3, as we all know, the man, Eve first is seduced by the serpent into eating the forbidden fruit. She then convinces Adam to eat it. Both are expelled from the garden and from eating the tree of life forever kind of forward. And so from here we have this story really represents the kind of permanent situation of life. this archetypical situation that we all live in, and that we do live in a walled garden. And it's sort of half structure, it's half walled, but it's also, half nature, right? And it's filled with kind of an element of chaos. And it's paradise, it's warmth, it's love, it's sustenance, but it's also a place where something can pop up at any moment and knock you off. And I think, that's something we can all sort of empathize with. We are all in a walled garden, and there's always potentially a snake, and it can arise sort of at any time. So I think that we're all sort of familiar with the story. We know its plot, but I think a really key element that Peterson wants us to think about isn't as much the eating of the fruit, but what happens after. So when God creates an Adam and Eve, they don't really appear to be very conscious, at least not at the beginning, or at least they're not self-conscious. And what we see when this serpent appears is that the serpent has a significance sort of evolutionarily, that we evolved in trees. We have really good eyes for that reason, that we could see snakes, and snakes are chosen in this way because they have a repulsive quality to humans. They stick out for us right away, and we've really evolved to see them. When Adam and Eve eat from the tree of knowledge, they suddenly are awoken. They realize some really horrible things. They realize that they're vulnerable. They realize that they're naked, they're unprotected, they're unarmed in a jungle of nature. And this nakedness, it's not sexual, it's a sort of coming awakening of consciousness, right? That they suddenly notice their own vulnerability, and it prompts them to just sort of skitter off and hide. And in this way, they really feel, Peterson says, sort of unable to stand before God, right? Even though they're made in their image, they're unable to kind of stand confidently. And so God kind of calls for Adam for this time to go on a walk with him. And Adam replies, "I heard you, God, but I was naked and I hid." And it's at this point that God banishes the first man and woman from paradise, and out into the unconscious animal world, into the horrors of kind of history and human history itself. And so it's this ending that I think is particularly important for us, or I know it was quite moving for me. I never really thought about it, that the idea of understanding your vulnerability and your kind of brokenness, and still and God kind of calling toward that, and not being able to walk again with God despite that vulnerability and that brokenness, is really, I think, what Peterson calls for us to kind of overcome. That yes, we all are awakened to the kind of limitations of our own consciousness or of our own humanity, and yet calling for us to walk again with God, or walk again in the idealized form of the Logos, is really how we start to reconcile that kind of interaction with chaos. So why tell this story? Why is this story so important? Because chaos exists in every Eden, and we have Edens in every element of our lives. It will catch up to us. It's really just a matter of time. And it's what we do when faced with that chaos, what our path becomes, what that way becomes, what we say, that can really start to rectify that.
Thanks, Claire. And kind of now applying the lens that we've been using about order and chaos, let's kind of just break down the story real quick, so you can kind of see the pattern that emerges in a lot of myths. So at the beginning, there's Tehom and Tohu. For anyone who watched the lecture, the definitions of Tehom is the unfathomable, the undifferentiated source of all existence. And you can kind of think of this as the totality of everything. right? It's like everything's together. And then tohu is essentially a chaotic condition, a place without color or form, the subjective effect of chaos. As I mentioned before, if you were to hear someone whisper right behind you, that feeling. So when chaos itself interacts with the logos or the word of God, which is the ordering force in this story, because you have this kind of unshaped mass and then this thing that shapes it into form. When that happens, that it's then and only then that being exists. And Peterson kind of points out that the idea is that until you have consciousness, you cannot truly say that reality exists at all. And it goes back to the old idea of if a tree falls in the forest, does it make a noise or does it make a sound? And the classic, if you're an empirical scientist, you'll say like, yeah, of course, just no one heard it. But the point here is, well, the air vibrated, but was there a sound? Because a sound is an affect. The sound is something that happens internally. And just like sound, sight, and everything else that we use to describe reality, it's an internal mechanism first. So therefore, it is only when consciousness itself comes into existence through the mixing of both, chaos and order, or the logos and tehom, that we can even say that reality truly exists. So this is more of an attempt to try to conceptualize how our consciousness itself came to be and what was necessary for it to come to be. And it's at least it can be interpreted in that sense. And then the next, as Claire had pointed out, is the importance that God identifies with the logos, that God identifies man and himself with the logos, that it is the logos that brings about all of reality, but it is also the very thing that we all carry. It is the very thing that we all have inside us, this divine spark. And if you don't see that, or if you think that's all just BS, I need only ask you, who can shape the world outside us? What is a God if not someone who can imagine something and then manipulate the things around them to create that thing? You can make and shape the potential of reality more than any other being that we know of. How are you not godlike is essentially the case. Sure, maybe what you got to complain about is how fast you can do it or how effective it is, but you have the capacity to do it, which is more than anything else in this world can claim. And because we have that capacity to manipulate potential, to choose potential, this is also a little bit of a tidbit from another lecture, but I think is really relevant here. This is exactly what Peterson means when he talks about heaven and hell. Okay, if we conceptualize ourselves as logos embodied in flesh, and we choose what potential comes to existence, well, then there's two natural conclusions to that. What would happen if we did everything right? What would happen if we did everything wrong, right? If we do everything right, if every single potential choice that we had, we made correctly, what would reality look like? And you could say that'd be almost indistinguishable from heaven, right? Kingdom of God on earth. Now, what would happen if we fucked up every single choice? Indistinguishable from hell. And that on that end, we've gotten pretty close. And that's how Peterson conceptualizes the 20th century. It's like, look at Nazi Germany, the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. All those are great examples of us doing really well to mess everything up and get pretty close to hell. So the ideas of heaven and hell are more of the maximum possibility on both ends. Now, as Claire said, you can definitely just say, yeah, who cares? Those are all BS stories. None of that matters. Nobody believes that. It's irrelevant. But as we mentioned before, and I think someone had mentioned Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson debate. Here's where Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson really cross. Because for Peterson, what he points out is, look, that idea, and it's not a Christian idea, it's in plenty of other religions, but that idea is very important. The idea that we have a spark of divinity. The idea that if I kill someone, no matter who, no matter what they've done, no matter how terrible they are, I've destroyed something that is of ultimate value. That is the thing we're supposed to value more. similar to the divine path, something divine was killed when I kill someone. And it is that idea that gives us all, as individuals, moral value. If we get rid of that idea, then why can't I kill people? Simply because it makes somebody feel upset? Simply because their opinion tells it wrong? And Peterson knows that here he's jumping on the more religious end. And that's why the debate was, religious versus science. But that's, for anyone who's curious, that is where he makes that jump. So now that we've got the general story, some of the meanings, and why these meanings actually do matter and why these thoughts do matter, because as Peterson points out, this story was just an amalgamation of a lot of other stories that have already existed. In fact, there's a lot of people that complain about the Bible having contradictions. And Peterson's like, it's kind of more of a feature than anything out about the Bible, because what the Bible was essentially was a bunch of different maps, as we described earlier, coming together of different groups and saying like, well, we believe this. Yeah, well, we believe this. Like, well, this guy kind of seems similar to this guy. It's like, all right. And kind of layering of all these different myths so that you could create one singular myth that all the tribes could then group around. And through that evolution of ideas is the idea of where we got our natural rights. And that's Peterson's case. So now we're going to look at a different example as to how we get to state and authority through the Inuma Elish with Victor. Victor, would you like to share your screen?
Absolutely, yeah.
I'll stop by. Yeah, so real quick, while you set up Victor, I'll answer one question. Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson departed in their views from me viewing the debate. And I mean, they did it in a lot of things, but essentially Sam Harris made the case that you can just justify our value just inherently, just say that like, well, we're the most important things. Well, why? Say, well, because we value ourselves, but it's not really a justification. It's just a statement.
All right, so going in, can you hear me, guys?
Yes.
All right, can you hear me?
Yep.
All right, well, thanks so much. And so extending the theme of order and chaos and the divinity of an individual, let's discuss a story from an old culture from the land of Sumeria. And this is also a story from Mesopotamia. And the story has mainly two major characters. That's an order and a chaos. So here you see a chaos, and the chaos, or the word chaos, that can also, we can extend the definition of it to potential, something that has good and bad. And that is represented in the form of a dragon here. And the order is represented as someone who is chasing it. Going into the story, the story opens with two main characters, as I was saying, and the characters' names are Tiamat and Apsu. Tiamat is considered living in a salt water. Think of ocean. Think of something that is really wild out there. And there is another character that is represented in the form of fresh water. So what happens is Apsu, which represents fresh water, comes into embrace with Tiamat, and it forms a pre-cosmogonic egg. That's the surface level of it, and they produce what we call elder gods. So these elder gods, we have to think in terms of forces more than gods, and these are the elder forces, elder gods. And as the story goes, these new gods that are created, they are more noisy. They don't have a structure. They don't think of a 3-year-old kid running around and don't know what to do, but they do have some kind of power, some kind of they can operate in the world. So they go ahead and they actually kill Apsu. Apsu is the one that made them exist. So what happens? They go and kill Apsu, and this actually infuriates the Tiamat. And Tiamat and Apsu, we can think of them as two partners. And Apsu, knowing that they killed Tiamat thinking that they killed Apsu, it gets really furious, and it comes again, and it tries to attack and kill these primordial elder gods. And these gods, they kind of find it that Tiamat is coming for them, and they are scared. And while this is happening, these gods actually form their children, and one of their grandchild is Marduk. And Marduk has a set of characters. So when Marduk is born, his father looks at him, and he finds that this particular Marduk has double the power of existing gods, and he has all-seeing eyes, and he has large ears, and when he speaks, fire blazes through his mouth. And the character is more of a sun-like character. And all these gods, they come to an understanding that they cannot face Tiamat, and they nominate Marduk to go and face Tiamat. And Marduk agrees to it, but on one condition. The condition being, he will be the in charge going forward, and he will be the one who forms the structure afterwards. And everyone agrees with this, and they make him go face Tiamat. He goes ahead and he faces Tiamat with two main things. So he actually faces Tiamat with a net and a sword. A net represents capturing the thing that we cannot capture, and making it into a particular form, and then making it into pieces. So this is what Apsu does, and he brings a new order to the cosmogony. So this is a story of this is from Mesopotamia.
Thank you, Victor. All right, and we're now back to mine, correct? Perfect. So again, let's try to apply a similar lens here with this myth. And very quickly, Tiamat, who is a dragon, and a little side note for anyone who doesn't know, a lot of times chaos can be represented as a dragon, especially chaos that collapses that previous map that we mentioned. And mostly because chaos, a dragon is essentially all the things that our ancestors would be afraid of. We're tree-dwelling monkeys, so snakes, alligators, hawks, and fire tend to all be horrifying things. So if you just put that in a blender, you get a dragon. And a lot of times you'll see chaos embodied as that, as a giant dragon of some form. And then Apsu is essentially the representation of order and culture. So as the story goes, Tiamat and Apsu come together and mate, essentially, or become locked in a sexual embrace. And through that embrace, similar to the Garden of Eden, through that interconnection between chaos and order, beings appear again, begin to start again. Only in this case, they're elder gods and they're primordial forces. They're described as very powerful, but not always responsible or clever or fully in control. But they themselves can then give birth to other gods. And now, if you take all this as from a psychological perspective, things get much more interesting. Whenever before consciousness can develop, you develop a lot of other primal necessary drives, but they're all not integrated. If I could get a little bit on the Jungian end, this is essentially where Marduk or consciousness comes in and brings them all into one force. As your personality, as Peterson says, as your personality develops, you have to bring everything. It's essentially you're creating a team of yourself, of all the different drives that you want. You're prioritizing them, giving them a hierarchy, and listening to all your different drives. Naturally, Jung noted, but when you do that, you're naturally not going to include everything. There's going to be parts that have to be left out. Your urge to punch people whenever you see them or whenever they annoy you, yeah, that's going to be left out. Your urge to act the exact opposite, to do something that's been deemed the not acceptable for your gender, that's going to be left out. And that's where you start getting things such as the shadow, the anima, or the animus. It's the things that are repressed and pushed back that you're not allowed to express. And Marduk is kind of the thing that then brings it all together. And that's why integration is bringing all those parts, once you've actually survived and became an adult, bringing all those parts also back into the fold. So they also have a voice. So they also can be expressed. Now, a couple of things that I do want to hit on this that I think are also very important and applying the same lens is that when the elder gods, and I did like Victor's idea of imagining them like 3-year-olds, because I think that works pretty well. But when the elder gods are essentially acting, there's consequences. And Peterson kind of notes that any action always has consequences. And naturally, without consciousness, you're not aware of those consequences. So what happens? The elder gods playing around, they're doing whatever it is they do, they accidentally kill Apsu. Well, what's Apsu? Well, it's a representation of culture. It's a representation of society. It's a representation of order. What happens after he dies? They hide in his body and they live there. And this is a beautiful metaphor for the idea of, this metaphor really hit me when I went to an old government building, a GSA building, and I walked in, and in the elevator, it looked like it was from the 50s. It looked like nothing had changed since it was from the 50s. And it was that realization of every single person that worked here when this thing was built is probably already dead. We're living in the body, the dead culture of our ancestors. And what happens when nothing changes, when they don't adapt? Chaos comes back. Chaos comes back with a vengeance because we killed the culture. And that's kind of one of the lessons of this, that if you're always living in the past, you're always using the past to your advantage. But it's also your responsibility to revilify what it is that you're living on for the next generation to then live in your dead body, right? Or in your dead culture or your dead effect. Now, another thing that I did want to also talk about, because this story also has a lot. And the reason I picked this story or this image is because of the 4 eyes. And when Marduk is born, he is equal to the gods. He surpasses all the elder gods, including his parents. And one of the qualities is that has 4 eyes, 4 ears, but also that he's hard to look upon. And I cannot look at this picture for very long. I get dizzy, and I feel like it has that natural effect of like, it's very hard to look at because it hurts your brain to try to look at it. But essentially, why is it that what is it about him that is so special? What makes him the hero? And it's partly because his capacity to pay attention, which is going to come into play later on as we explore more myths. Partly is his ability to pay attention and to see. And sight a lot of times tends to be understood as an awakening or an enlightenment. You see it even in the Eden myth whenever they eat the fruit of knowledge, or the forbidden fruit, the scales from their eyes fall and they can see, right? It's the sense of enlightenment, of true vision. And the difference here is that he has true vision, but then also can speak different things into existence with true power. And true power, in the sense that it actually matters and can do something, is symbolized here by the fact that when he speaks, fire comes out. And so when he confronts chaos, how can we interpret that? Well, when he confronts chaos, he does several things. Peterson notes that he first throws a net around chaos. And I think this is a perfect example of exactly what this is. But Peterson kind of points out that is how we handle chaos. When we're brave enough to handle chaos, that is what we do, is we first encapsulate it in an explanatory network, which essentially just means we use the things we know to explain the things we don't. We put everything around it. A really good example that currently is happening, and hopefully still is happening, is the Monolith, which I think everyone's seen that side story, a random monolith made of steel, middle of nowhere. What is it? We have no clue. Now, I'm not trying to say I know anything, but what I'm saying is the fact that none of us have a clue what the hell that is, and then the fact that we all use what we know to try to make sense of it. Some are like, oh, that's the 2001 Space Odyssey. Someone's like, oh, that's just modern art. Another person may say, it's like, oh, it's a PR move, but nobody actually knows. So what is it that we're doing? We're trying to use what we do know to understand what we don't. And in that way, we kind of limit what it can be, and then slowly get close as we understand it more and more. Once it's captured, we tear it into pieces, and we find uses for it. So the first one, we saw it, right? And we found it. Now there's a bunch that are starting to pop up. Now we don't know if they're copycats or what else, but just the idea alone is already starting to copy itself. And Peterson kind of points out that this is exactly what humans do. And if we go back to the scheme of the way, when things fall apart, we still do have the capacity to be creative with the things that have fallen apart and use those pieces to create something novel, something new, and something that transcends our previous descent or previous death. In the same way that the other patterns happen. So we have Tiamat. He confronts chaos, and he's willing to take, he's the god that's willing to take everything on, essentially. So why does this matter? Why does this old myth matter? Well, it matters because of how it was worshipped and what those worshiping meant. Peterson brings up the New Year's traditions of the emperor, points out that how the New Year's tradition would function is every year you would take the emperor, take him out of the city, because the city again is a walled garden, and it's essentially this place, the known. You bring him out of the known, and then you strip him of everything that makes him emperor. You reduce him back to a man, and only a man. And then you force him to confess of how he hasn't been embodying Marduk as best as he could. Because the idea here, and it's really important that we understand this, is that the authority, the thing that should be in charge, the emperor, is a direct avatar of Marduk. It's essentially something like this. We don't know, we're surrounded by things we don't know. We don't know what to do about that. Well, who should be in charge? Who should we follow? Who should determine what it is we do? Follow the person that is willing to take on the chaos, the unknown, bravely conquer it, bring it back, and then bring it to our benefit. That's the person that needs to be in charge. That's the strategy that works. Okay, well, you're the closest we got. It's your job to become that thing, to become that idea. And it's only as close as you can represent Marduk. That's how much authority you get. The closer you are to Marduk, the better we all are. And we're going to take you out of the town every year, humiliate you, make you face the fact that you haven't always been perfect and you have been falling short because you're naturally going to. And then after that, they make him reenact the battle and essentially make him act as though he is the Marduk of the people and protecting his state. And then once he wins, he mates with a ritualistic prostitute. Now, this isn't necessarily a reward, more of it's a similar symbol. The prostitute herself represents Tiamat. She represents, as we mentioned in the beginning, and as we mentioned with Genesis and at the beginning of the Inuma Elish, chaos in a sexual embrace with order. And anytime that chaos is in a sexual embrace with order, there's also the possibility for a renewed state, for a constantly I'm losing the word, but
Rebirth, even. I mean, it's
essentially a rebirth. And so here we now see how this story goes from trying to understand how consciousness functions to what can be done about it, to then, all right, who should we then follow because of it? And Peterson, for anyone who's followed him on his Maps of Meaning lectures, constantly follows how this idea changed and morphed through time, similar to what Shrikant does with a lot of other ideas from 52 Living Ideas. But it's this idea of what does it mean to be conscious? What are we supposed to do about the fact that our conscious is extremely limited, and though we do have abilities to change and choose potential, we don't have the capacity to ever truly handle novelty. There's always going to be things we can't account for, and they're always going to be coming in. And the closest solution we currently have is a derivative of these myths, of these stories. So essentially, this myth shows in a dramatic sense how the state can be redeemed. Essentially, to just quickly conclude, it shows us this path, the way. It shows us the collapse and here's the important part, what is it that we should follow to then be reintegrated after a collapse?
One element of the Marduk story that I love is when he puts this net around, he casts this net, and then he cuts it all up, right, and creates the world out of the pieces. And I think that is just the perfect metaphor for Peterson's kind of self-help philosophy, is that when we are in chaos and when the dragon seems so big, grasping it, putting a net around it, really understanding it, and then cutting it up, parsing it up, speaking about each individual piece, and sort of symbolically mating with it and creating something out of it, something new, something that can sort of be reborn. And so I think when we think about fighting our own demons and understanding our own dragons, that element of that Marduk does of breaking it up and creating something out of the pieces is really beautiful.
All right, and I think that'll be it. Shrikant, do you want to jump to questions?
Yes, if you could stop sharing the screen.
Oh, yeah, sorry. There we go.
All right, folks, so it's time for Q&A. We have 4 rules as usual. Number 1, type exclamation mark in chat or raise your hand in Zoom in order to speak. What we're doing in this first stage is we're just asking questions. What we're going to do after that is we're going to divide into breakout rooms. I'm delighted to see that over 20 people are reading the book. This is incredible. So I'm putting people who are reading the book together in breakout rooms, okay? After the breakout rooms, we're going to come back here, and that is the time that you will get to share all your takeaways, all your thoughts about the book. Currently, right now, let's do just questions, and then we will talk about opinions later on. So rule number 1, type exclamation mark. Rule number 2, keep on topic. Rule number 3, be brief. Rule number 4, speak your mind. Feel free to disagree with anybody on anything and do so courteously. All right, so Cotton is first. Cotton, go ahead. Oh, just a second. I need to enable everybody else. Just a second. Yes, Cotton, go ahead.
Hi. First of all, this was so fascinating. My mind is blown, and I'm so bummed that I'm not reading the book, but I just reserved it from the library. But anyway, I just want, could you, Roger, explain again that pivotal point? Like, for example, when you're trying to confront this unknown chaos, like, for example, the example with the emperor coming out of his walled place, then he has to become the Marduk, was that right?
Right.
Is it kind of so that, let's say you're so, it's kind of like a way to conquer the fear by taking on these very strong characteristics of these godlike like dragons and such, so that you have these, you kind of take on these traits that you don't normally have, but you might need it to confront this chaos. Like you're kind of like this avatar, but underneath you're fueled by the power of those dragon people. I mean, sorry if
Oh
it's
yeah. So yeah. So essentially, when the emperor is as the emperor is in power, he is supposed to essentially be the embodiment of the deity, the embodiment of Marduk. A more probably Western way that you can think of it is, why do Christians, maybe not as often now, but why do Christians a lot of times why would they wear bracelets that would say, what would Jesus do? Right? Because essentially Jesus, the deity, is a template for behavior. So in other words, anytime you face a problem, you need to first consider yourself as the deity and be an avatar for that deity. And that is the guidance, that is the way for how to confront that situation. Does that make sense? It's a similar premise with like Marduk.
yes, bingo. Thank you.
Next up is Joe.
So fantastic presentation, guys. One thing that I've been thinking about is the idea, and actually Victor had mentioned it prior, is the idea of chaos being opportunity. So the process that you just talked about, does there have to be a collapse in order for there to be something better that emerges from it? Because the idea that we can engage with what is unfamiliar to us in a logical way, in an orderly way, I think is actually, it's invigorating. Whereas I think chaos is starting to getting in this particular instance, is only looked at as destructive, or something bad has to happen in order for us to emerge from it. So I was wondering if you could comment a little bit of the distinction between those two.
Yeah, and good point. Chaos is not it, as I mentioned, it's the source of everything. So that means it's the source of everything good and everything bad. And as far as the idea of the collapse, the game seems to be set up normally that, and this is why a snake appears in the garden. This is why chaos seems to always appear, is that if you just did nothing, and I think it might be the problem of entropy, if you just do nothing, if you keep the status quo, chaos will find a way in. But it's like, and if you do nothing, you'll have to deal with that forced collapse, right? But the hero myth, which we'll get into later, is the person that goes outside of the known, of the known of order, finds chaos, conquers it, and then brings it back for the betterment of the entire group, right? So it's not necessarily that there has to be a collapse, but sometimes a collapse isn't always the worst thing. If a hero leaves and finds something that's more important or more valuable than the thing that they most valued and comes back, it's a collapse and a reintegration, but into an improved state, right? However, the kind of situation seems that you essentially have the problem of entropy, that the collapse is ever coming. The state is always in need of being redeemed. The state is never enough. So therefore, you must either A, sit there until everything falls apart, and then you're really going to be in trouble, or B, the hero is the person that at the first sign of a big threat goes outside, protects both the status quo, but then also brings something new that revitalizes order, if that makes sense.
Yeah, can I just ask a
Yeah.
really quick follow-up? No.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, no. So I think it's like later in the book, he speaks about the idea of familiar and unfamiliar and how those two, and I think that's maybe the way I was thinking about how to engage with chaos. So that you're expanding your knowledge, essentially.
Yeah, and that's the I don't want to get too into it, but that's the differences of known knowns, known unknowns, unknown knowns, and unknown unknowns, right? It's the levels of chaos. A known known, it's when you're in order. You know what's happening and you know what's going on, and you know that the events are going to happen and they happen as they should. And then as you go down, it gets more negative to some extent, but there are some positive aspects. That's because essentially the chaos and order can also be thought of as the archetypes of the Great Mother and the Great Father, for those reading the book. So it's essentially the same. It's the same topic. It's the same thing. It's the same concepts. We just personified those categories. So sorry, not trying to get too into it, but your question is essentially that that chaos can also be interacted in a beneficial, good way, right?
Right. Essentially, and just how that process looks as opposed to the process of the collapse. So the
right. So, yeah, and that would be, from a mythic standpoint, that would be when the hero goes out and gets supernatural help that he didn't expect, which is the benevolent mother giving support, or chaos handing you something. It's the equivalent of you walking. A small version of this is you walking outside and finding $5 that you didn't expect. A bigger version of this would be you taking on a research position, or taking on something chaotic, or even just taking on something that you yourself would be beneficial for you, but you're still pushing that limit. And then that in that relationship, chaos becomes extremely beneficial because you're meeting it voluntarily. In other words, chaos is horrifying because it contains everything bad. But if you're brave enough to confront that, you have the potential to extract all the things that are good in it.
Next up is going to be Claire, Shrikant, Jean, Anderson, and Maritza. Claire.
Okay, I think this relates, but I'm still kind of confused by this concept of the unknown. In the book, he describes the unknown. He says it can be regarded as possessed of stable characteristics in a broad sense. That really confuses me because I would think that the unknown would be unstable. And then he says these characteristics are revealed in the actions we undertake in response to the appearance of unexpected things. So how is the unknown possessed of stable characteristics?
Because
what page is that?
109.
What he means by that is that there's stable characteristics, as in he goes into this idea of like what's better to have, a solution to a problem, or a solution to the set of problems, or a solution to all sets of all problems. In other words, rather than learning how do I solve this problem, you learn how do I solve problems. And once you make that abstraction, that's how chaos can have a common, does that make sense? A common and stable effect. So one common and stable effect of chaos is we don't like being in it. Our entire sensory system gets overloaded, and the more we're exposed to it, the less comfortable we are. With some bravery and some training, we can be on that edge, which is where he believes that the way points to, right? Constantly being 1 foot in chaos, 1 foot in order. But it's not necessarily always a comfortable situation. It's a meaningful one, but it requires that you're constantly pushing that limit of yourself. So it's more of like those qualities that are consistent. It's like, how do you deal with things you don't know? That's a consistent problem and can have a consistent solution. So one of the ones that we have is evolutionarily, we orient, as we talked about, but then also we have both curiosity and fear, because like curiosity is like, this might be a good thing. Fear is like, oh, this could kill me.
So although the unknown or chaos might appear novel or different, or there's all sorts of different forms of it, the way we respond to it as well as the way to combat it are stable.
It's more how we perceive it and how we react, not necessarily the ways to combat it, because every situation is going to have a novel solution, but rather, like, for example, yeah, just how we perceive it. A lot of times we'll perceive it as I mean, we can go to the Dragon of Chaos, like the worst case scenarios, like 9/11, right? For most Americans, when 9/11 happened, there's that weird sense of like, I don't even know what the hell this is. I don't even know what this means. Or with COVID, right? Like, I don't even know what this means for us, for me, for my family, for my country, for my nation, for my history, for my legacy. Like, all those things are now, and then it has that same effect on us, regardless of what the unknown thing actually is. Because what it does is destroy our map of where we are. And because it always does that, it appears to us to have a similar commonality, even no matter how different it may be.
Well, I got something really interesting from this, the Inuma Elish myth that brought many things together for me. I see the first two, Tiamat and Apsu, as existential, kind of metaphysical conditions of being, kind of chaos and order. And then you have the next two, which are kind of conscious, or which are, aspects of our inner life. So you have like the chaos in existence, and then you have the order in existence that is built up. And then you have these kind of subconscious or unconscious, or our system one, which are these elder gods, which kind of don't really care about the chaos which destroy it. And then you have the conscious, which is the system two, which is able to kind of pay attention, which is able to kind of bring things back together. So I see these four things as being two being kind of metaphysical, and two being epistemological, two being outside, two being inside, and they kind of sit on the top of one another. So I thought that was very interesting. Any comments? Any thoughts?
Just as an initial response to Claire's question, perhaps Peterson is, and I wrote in the chat, perhaps Peterson is referring to the structural elements of the psyche.
Okay, thanks, George. So what we'll do, George, you have any questions? You'd like to raise any?
I have no questions, but
okay.
I want to applaud everyone. Wonderful, coherent job.
Okay, excellent. So it's going to be Jean, let's see, Jean, Anderson, Mariza, and Paul. Jean, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question. So I have some challenge actually reading this book. I would have a great expectation, but I think maybe it's just not in the right time to read it. It just, I try to learn everything with some kind of relevance. Maybe I don't have the Christian background or something, or mythology. It's like, I understand the chaos and order and the story, but I just don't see a lot of relevance. And it seems the text is a little bit hard to read in some way. And so I just wonder, it seems 12 rules is more direct related. This is more the conceptual level. And I'm trying to, I hope it later get better, but I just trying to see how the relevance to our philosophy life, I understand chaos and order. I listen to others as well. I agree with that. I just wonder, what do you guys think about it? I just facing this challenge right now.
No,
Go ahead, Roger.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I don't think you're the only one. This book is pretty complex, and I think the hardest part, and I think that's kind of what I'm trying to provide, is that it requires that you look at myth as a very different, it just requires a different perspective, which is not, doesn't feel natural, is like what I would say. Is like, it doesn't, you have to suspend, it's almost like watching a film. You have to suspend belief enough to consider if the point makes sense, right? If the idea of how our psychology works, and if the idea that maybe us as conscious animals were first and foremost trying to describe our reality, not by the scientific view, which hadn't even been invented yet, but rather as it was being experienced, right? How does it feel as it felt? And kind of trying to get out of that modern point of view. But that's, at least for me, that's the hardest part, is breaking out of that modern perspective to then consider, it's like, all right, how would someone who had never had education of the sort that I have conceptualize reality? Because you have to also remember that human cognition hasn't really changed since we started, since the start of history. So then they were as smart as us. They just don't have the same training and framework that we do. So they have a different one, but it might be just as complex or just as nuanced. So giving them that credit, how would you make sense of the world? How would you understand consciousness? How would you understand where consciousness had to happen, or how did it even come to be? What things had to come together? How does reality work? All those really deep and hard questions, how that, we then jump into. But then again, to even take that view, you also have to adapt a Jungian view, which I think is also a very complex and hard leap if you like, without a lot of time exposed to it. So I would say trying to use, first and foremost, like I said, the order and chaos mechanic to try to see these myths was just kind of a starter. There's a lot more depth to this. The book's going to be really dense. I would highly recommend you look at the video lectures, where he goes into much more explanations to why these beliefs matter. I tried to keep it simple. Tried to hit some practicality with like authority. So how do we even choose who's in charge? How do we even choose who's in power? It's like, well, because at least in Mesopotamia, why did they choose that emperor? Why listen to this guy? Why let him have all the things he gets to have? And it's like, we are just primates after all. Why does he get to be on the top of the hierarchy? It's like, well, because he's actually trying to be possessed, or is embodying this extremely complex and abstract idea that we as a culture came up, that we realize is the best way that us as humans can survive in this thing that none of us understand, right? But it takes a very like meta, like far away point of view to start to see what he's even trying to point at. And so I don't think you're alone at all. And because for me, when I first started this, I just thought he was crazy. I was just like, I don't know. This guy's talking about Lion King and Pinocchio. I don't know about all this stuff, but it at least for me, I eventually found it convincing once I really got into it.
Folks, so I'm just delighted that over 20 people are reading the book. So in the takeaways, please, people who are reading the book, I'm going to call on you first, and please talk about your experience of reading the book, what you're getting out of it. And let's share it at that time. All right, so it's going to be Anderson next. Anderson, go ahead.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to be here. It's the first time. It's been a surprise to me that there's this kind of groups. And it's been very, open-minded to me because I have a background in theology and I've been studying Genesis for a while. And it has been very, very interesting how Peterson approaches Genesis and how encouraging it is. From a practical point, from chaos to order, when God, everything is void and dark. And that's not just a theoretical concept that many theologians and many preachers focus in the theoretical. And, and you mentioned earlier when he crosses with Sam Harris, that, denies all of that. But how practical it is. And my question is, the concept of chaos and order in our lives, in our personal lives, in our daily lives, because I just started reading the books, but I've listened to his podcast many times. Like I go back and listen to them again, and he says something like, when you feel you're in chaos. For example, you're changing a job and you're not enjoying that job. Stay there hanging on that job until you get to where you want you want to get, To me, that's an awareness of that my life is in chaos. That's like a natural state, like a continuing thing. What do you think is required to keep that awareness that, we are in constant chaos, or when we feel that we put something in order, we have to go back and keep, cleaning out the chaos, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, essentially, as I mentioned earlier, it's the problem of entropy. Unfortunately, if you leave everything alone, things don't stay. They don't get better by themselves, which really sucks. But then even if you fix things, they won't stay fixed. Things are constantly falling apart. Everything that is ordered is only ordered for a temporary amount of time. So it's us constantly building this thing that is constantly deteriorating. And I think, yeah, from my understanding, I think you're referring to the idea of the suffering, right? That life is there's always a weight to bear. There's always something to carry. So even if you're stuck in a job that you don't want, but there might be some cost, there's, a weight there. I would say the main thing and the most important thing is that you have a good map, that you have a plan. So like the map that we were showing, you want to make sure that map is actually getting there where you want to get, because I think plenty of people have been in the situation where you think you're going to get the promotion, or you think you're going to get that job. You're like, I got it. Like, there's no way, I'm super perfect for it. And then you don't.
And this,
right?
it becomes like a conflict of values, where you have to decide, as you mentioned earlier, what's really significant. And that when you face that chaos, I believe that, one has two options. You face it, you make the plan, or just forget about it and get used to it, right?
Well, that's a great point, because that's essentially where it's eventually going to lead to, is the idea of you have two responses whenever you're in this unfair situation, the unfair situation of life, and that's the Cain and Abel response. You can either take full responsibility for it, or you can be resentful and hate everyone and not engage in the game of life anymore because it's not worth it, right? So, but there's two responses to life itself.
Folks, so it's going to be Maritza, Paul, Julie, and Victor, and then we'll do breakout rooms followed by takeaways. Maritza, go ahead.
I am Shrikant. I'm going to go rogue for just 1 minute. I just wanted to add a little something in it as a response to Claire's question. So, I haven't gotten as far as page 109. I'm only maybe about 60, 65 pages in. But in the statement you mentioned that Peterson tells us that the unknown is stable, maybe it would help to look at it from a perspective of, reason versus emotion, or logic versus emotion, because the unknown it takes us off of our rational thinking selves that we constantly strive to be. Well, I do, hopefully most do as well. And the unknown is going to invariably thrust us into the emotional. And even when we're trying so hard to be rational beings and to move forward with purpose and being reasoning people, we at our very core, we're emotional creatures. And so I believe that is why one would say that the unknown is stable, because emotions are always there. And it is a stability in life that no matter how rational one is in this moment or the next moment, the emotion is still there. We can control it, and we should control it in most situations, but it is an actual human impossibility to control it in all moments. So sorry, I just want to add that. As for my question about, I don't think Peterson mentions, or I have not crossed it yet in the videos or the book. I didn't know if he distinguishes between internal chaos, or external chaos. In one of the stories he gives us, he talks about somebody who is thinking they're doing good in their job that they've had for 5 years, and then they're thrown for a loop and they're fired, and they were not expecting this. And as Peterson tells us the story, he shows how this individual took something that was a chaotic break for him and makes it worse by creating their own internal chaos that just exacerbates the chaos. So is there a distinction made here in the maps of meaning for the internal versus the external, or is it kind of considered one and the same?
From my understanding, he conceptualizes it as one and the same because essentially it is. So if I remember correctly, that's when he's kind of lying to himself, right?
I guess he said he didn't really want the job after all, but he
Right.
spent an entire month being, just shovingly and not eating and not taking care of himself or looking for a job.
Yeah, and that was kind of like what we were talking about, that idea of that resentfulness of just like giving up. And it goes back to that idea of that map, right? Whenever you have that map and it collapses, is what you thought was going to happen and where you wanted to go and how you're going to get there doesn't work, and you have no way out. You need to find a new way to manage this, a new way to act. But that can be caused by yourself, right? That can be caused by your own lies to yourself. You being in denial is just as bad as you not knowing where you're at. Just as bad as you not knowing your wife is cheating is also just as bad as you knowing your wife is cheating but not wanting to face it, right? The effect is the same. The chaos that comes afterwards is the same. It's just, the cause itself may be, like how it got in may be different, but the effect ends up being the same.
I think also of the chaos of, people often talk of the chaos of achieving a goal, right? That you've worked your whole life for something and you get there and it's shattering and devastating because you haven't produced a meta map that was even bigger than that. So I think, from a terminal illness to even sometimes a triumph can turn you into that internal chaos.
Wonderful. Next up is going to be Paul, Julie, and Victor. Paul, you need to unmute yourself.
I apologize. First of all, I am rarely impressed, but today, Roger, I am impressed. Honestly, your knowledge is unbelievable. I am impressed. Anyway, for Claire, chaos and order is always around us. If what I would like to mention, when you read anything from Jordan Peterson, he is very knowledgeable. He's basically polymath regards the history, philosophy, psychology, and his knowledge is very comprehensive. That means that he understands the order. Chaos is always around us. Roger, you used from history, 20 years old history of 9/11. I would go 9/11, 1938, just before the Second World War, or January of this year. People like me knew that something is coming right away. People like me knew in January that the system, the bad system, which is in China, will bring it. We were ready for it. I wasn't surprised at all, at all. I was trying to explain to people that something is coming. And it came exactly. So I wasn't surprised. It wasn't the same. People were surprised when 9/11 came, but many people knew that something like that would came. 1938, people knew that the Second World War was coming. One of them was Winston Churchill. They had the order, they had the knowledge, and chaos. They knew that chaos will take over. There is always and always will be fight between order and chaos. We have to support we have to go for the order, but chaos will be always here. And the knowledge of chaos, that's what will help us for future. In our future, we have to always. That gentleman who find out about his wife, You should always think, if she was beautiful, that somebody would go after her. If she wasn't strong enough, that something like that could happen. You have to always think that something like that can happen. That's your job. You cannot be completely surprised about anything. That's the order.
Excellent, Paul. Thank you. Thank you for that. Next up is going to be Julie, followed by Victor. Julie.
Okay. If you like have a belief system that works pretty well, like for example, that the world is a self-correcting universe, and when we come up against chaos and how we deal with it, if some of the ways we deal with it, like assuming assuming we have no power or the world's against us or whatever, it's an opportunity for us to take a look at what's not working in us. And for example, if we lose something and we put too much value on it, maybe we need to put value on something else. Like for me, so far, truth as a top value has not served me badly. That's why Dr. Phil always says, how's that working for you? Because there's things that we can do, and couldn't it not be that the way would be the way that eventually we'll all get around to the way to certain principles that are kind of universal and divine, like operating off of your sense of equity. It's a natural thing. If you catch things when they're early, before you keep hitting your wall and looking at it a certain way, and then you collapse because the universe is trying to tell you something. But if you get more in line with it, your own values, you could catch it earlier and not. And if you could think curiosity instead of curiosity in the face of chaos, it changes the whole thing. And keep pursuing truth. And I don't know.
Okay. Thank you, Julie.
That's a good point.
Next up is going to be Victor, and then we're going to do the breakout rooms. Go ahead, Victor.
All right. So I'd like to add a couple of my thoughts for Joe's question, the question of why there is a chaos, why there is a breakage of the actual system in a person or in a system, and why someone or something has to go into descent, and only then there is a redemption journey. So I actually really struggled with this question myself while reading the book. And even before that, I was so into the idea of, yes, if we can make a decision, if we can see a potential, if we can see an opportunity, and if we can make a map out of it and we can go ahead, logically it is possible. Logically we can make that progress. However, what we really struggle with as humans is the idea of fear, even when we know what we want to do, or the idea of hesitation. I think, and this point he tries to make in the book with various examples, giving the experiments done on animals. Like, the idea is to establish that fear is an a priori situation in an unknown place. So giving an example of rats being put in a hungry condition, and when they are taken into a new place, the first thing that they feel is fear. And it's the same case for humans too. And the idea is, in spite of fear, how can we go ahead? So that's the theme here. And one more point, I don't want to make it a theology discussion, but there is a recurring theme in Old Testament, and in various cases, in various places, where the actual character, where he or she wants to take a major step, they always hesitate. And there's a theme that goes into say, don't be afraid. And this happens multiple times. And the point being, we always struggle with the idea of hesitation. So that's my couple of things.
Wonderful. Thank you, Victor. And Roger, Claire, and Victor, that was a fantastic presentation. You keep outdoing yourself, so this is just great. All right, so we're going to do breakout rooms for 20 minutes, and then we are going to come back and share our takeaways. Those who have read the book, I would really like to know how it's going for you. So during your takeaways, so I'm starting the breakout rooms now. All right, welcome back, everybody. Okay, so now it's time for takeaways. So folks, I'm going to start with people who have read the book, and take your time, take about maybe up to 3 minutes to talk about the experience of reading the book, as well as your takeaways from this meetup. So I'm going to name people so you get to, and I'm going to tell you about 2 things that are coming up very closely connected to this. So you get a little bit of time to put together your thoughts. So first one is going to be Aiden, Clara, and David R. Okay, so folks, we have 2 very interesting events coming up. One on Saturday at 12:30 p.m. We're going through Jordan Peterson's new book, which is not out yet. And we did a meetup on an overview of the book, and rule number 2 of that book was voted to be the most interesting. And it is all about your future self. Your, the formulation is imagine who you could be and aim at it single-mindedly. So the questions that it's going to be a discussion, and we're going to ask everybody who wants to answer the questions 2 questions. Number 1, who do you want to be? What is your conception of your ideal self? And number 2, what's your plan to get there? And we're going to have a discussion on that. So that's going to be at 12:30 p.m. Eastern time on Saturday. At 2:30 p.m. on Sunday, Aiden will be here with a guest who's an expert in fairy tales and Jungian psychology. So she's going to take a whole bunch of fairy tales and show you how Jungian psychology works in fairy tales. All right, so those are the 2 things coming up. So it's going to be Alden, followed by Alden, Clara, and David R. Alden, floor is yours.
Thank you. So in our group, I think there's several of us that are still kind of in the preliminary stages of the book. For me, I found it to be, the language is not in my normal sphere, right? It's not my vernacular. So it's taking time to digest. And part of my experience is simply, while I can connect various words that I know, having them strung together the way they are is very foreign. And often I have to reread sentences and paragraphs to consistently make sense of it, especially because we know Jordan is being very specific with the words he's saying, right? He's not using the simplified version of what that sentence could mean. And so then for me, I always want to go back and say, well, why did he use these words? And usually that means my initial understanding was very narrow and there's a broader understanding to it, or multiple ways that can be interpreted. And that's both really enriching and at points intimidating to see, just how easily my mind tries to say, well, this is where it's going, and say, no, like be willing to back out and be open to where this where it will manifest. So it's slow going, but it's fun to kind of inch along through the story. I do find that the half-hour videos that accompany this, they feel so drastically different from the book that to me they're kind of like totally different retellings of the same story. One that's modern versus one that was perhaps a telling from 60 years ago. In terms of, the book is so much more dense, and the half-hour snippets are such like here's Jordan with his emphasis and emotion and idea, and then he moves on. And so I find them both quite valuable, but radically different enough that I'm really glad I have the book. So much of what, again, was brought up today, I'm glad to have more of the language in my brain. So that way, when we talk about a subject such as chaos, I don't have this snippet of an idea that I heard in a clip somewhere. I've sat with these ideas now for a while, because Jordan really sits into a huge, domain of what that could mean. And I just find that to be very impactful. And so again, I would encourage, just as you guys have, everyone to read the book if you can. is a totally different experience.
Excellent. I like your term, sat with the ideas for a long time. And I think most of us here have done that. And the good thing about, the powerful thing about that is that we have the background actually to understand and to actually understand any part of the book. So I encourage people to read the summaries that he provides for the entire book, all the chapters and all the sub-chapters. And you can dive into any part of it because you have actually heard the book from Jordan Peterson in many, many, many different forms, many, many different reincarnations. So you can dive in and look at things that you find interesting and then expand from there. Okay, next up is David Roller, George, and Stephen. David Roller.
So I've just actually started to read the book itself. Just got it this week, but I have been watching Jordan Peterson's videos and for some time now. And what I'm finding interesting in it, it actually causes me to rethink things and to try to integrate the stories, not just the stories as Peterson has relays them, but stories as other people tell essentially the same story. And it's interesting that what I'm seeing is the common thought line, the common meaning that's behind some of the stories. And Peterson, what I find him is very good at trying to draw out that thought process in you, which is to not look at the story at a superficial level of entertainment, but look at it as a construct of trying to relay or bring forward a message from the past, okay, from history. These stories all going back and they're building upon a prior story that's building upon a previous story. They're all going back, and I believe they're probably all going back to one source. I don't know that we're ever going to be able to point to that singular entity that created the first story that has perpetuated over time. But that's one of the things that I feel Peterson is bringing out, especially as I've watched the videos for Maps of Meaning, is how he brings forward the meaning or the significance behind the stories. And later on, I think we'll get to in the book, how he brings forward that even the movies that we're seeing that are being produced, the messages behind them, there's an underlying message or theme that's something that society needs, that's being brought forward. So that's what I really kind of enjoyed out of, the Maps and Meaning that Peterson did with this book, is giving you that encouragement to actually step through and step behind and go down into what was how this was put together and why it was written and presented the way it was for society at the time to benefit from it.
Wonderful. Thank you.
And one final insight that I will give, I did come across the video where Peterson described his writing process. And I think he was talking about his writing of Maps and Meaning. And he said that every sentence in the book I rewrote 5 times, and I stopped when I couldn't make it better. And which to me is an incredible effort to make something that precise and spend that much time on it so that you can convey a message in the, as you want to present it without a lot of, fluff, because you want to, you want the book to be big, so there's I've read things where it's like, I just read 4 paragraphs and it could have been 1 sentence. So that's one of the things that, and I think you're going to find that when you try to read the book, if you try to read it fast, it's very difficult to try to read. You have to take your time.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, David. George, I'm delighted you're here. You're the one who recommended Jordan Peterson to me all those years ago when I was trying to figure out Carl Jung.
Apologies.
So thank you very much for getting me started on that. But yes, Sir George, what are you getting from maps? What do you think of maps of meaning? What do you get from it?
First of all, I want to say thank you to Roger and Claire and the other gentleman. I forgot his name. You guys,
Victor.
Wonderful job. Wonderful job. It's obvious you prepared for it deeply. And David, I agree. It's a slow roll reading this type of material. I guess the first thing I want to say is that Jordan Peterson is very familiar with analytical psychology. He's very familiar with the works of Carl Gustav Jung. I also think that as any effective deep thinker, because he's certainly a good speaker and he articulates himself quite well, and he's a good writer as well. But what I take from it, or I guess an outcome of my relationship with Peterson as a reader and as a listener, is that he compels me, again, like any good thinker, to have a deep relationship with global humanities. If you're going to have a chance in masticating this type of material, you need to visit or revisit world literature, canonical and non-canonical. If you don't do that, I can't, like, you know, you got to know your Goethe. You need to read your Iliad, not to mention, you know, canonical biblical texts, and then commentaries on those canonical texts. And then you may have a chance. I think it speaks to Alden's words. He talks about becoming familiar with the language. Well, for me, that's how I become familiar with the language. I have to take a pause, go read my Persian myths, and then come back to that paragraph as an example, And lastly, I do want to say that, again, like any good deep thinker, I think he nourishes me to weave a new tapestry, you know, with regards to the human condition. Again, I say that both ontogenetically and phylogenetically. You know, he compels us to look at ourselves as individuals and as members of a community.
Thank you very much.
Or a diversity of communities, excuse me. Thank you.
Thank you, George. So next up is going to be Stephen, Maritza, and Vyom. Stephen.
Thank you. I got to say, Roger and Claire, wow. Really good. And I'm glad you, Roger, the idea of a PowerPoint was a great thing, because I was able to look at words. Thank you very, very much. And I liked Claire's adaptation. The thing I like about Jordan Peterson, because having read Joseph Campbell, who I was into before Jordan Peterson, and Carl Jung before that, they're great stories, but Jordan Peterson has such a practical goal in terms of his family therapy and family counseling. I like he tries to bring it down to the family thing. And just 3 points, because I've studied this a lot. I love the idea, Claire brought this out, about the web, or the net rather, and the sword. It's interesting that in many traditions that the universe begins with a web or a net, and that everything is connected. In Hindu, there's Indra's net. In Native American, there's grandmother spider's web. And then the sword chops it all up and creates all the separation. And it's our job as human beings to reconnect and get back to our true natures. I want to really acknowledge Victor, because he came out of the clear blue with his story of Marduk. I've studied the Hebrew of Genesis and made it a study. And I want to note there's a huge correlation. I'm going to mention 3 things and I'm done. In Genesis, it talks about God creates the heavens and earth. That's a merism, meaning everything. And the God that's spoken of there is defined in Genesis chapter, and John 1:1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. And about the 6th verse down, and the Word was of God. And so that there are actually 3 gods in Genesis. There's the Logos, the Word, in Genesis at the beginning. Then at the end of Genesis chapter 1, around verse 26, the gods, it says, and the gods, plural, say, let us create man after our image, male and female, created he, them. The he is complete misnomer. The gods are Elohim in Hebrew, and that's plural. And so it goes right along with Victor's story about this plurality of gods creating the universe. And then finally, in Genesis chapter 2, that's a second creation. The first Genesis chapter 1 seems to be a spiritual creation. And then in Genesis chapter 2, it says, okay, the whole world existed. Everything was here, except there was no human being plowing the ground. And so God, but at this point, it's Jehovah God, who is now the son of the God of Genesis chapter 1, who now creates Adam, and Adam is alone in the Garden of Eden, and it's not good for Adam to be alone. So now it's time to bring a helpmeet. So now God, Jehovah, brings all of these animals, and Adam names them, and there was no helpmeet to be found. And so then a woman is created. But let me make one point clearly. In the Hebrew, Adam is androgynous. Adam is not a man. And there is no mention of Adam, he, until Adam, androgynous, goes to sleep and God, Jehovah, pulls a rib out. And then now there's man and woman. And if you ask me, this is my editorial and I'm done, a woman is two X's and a man is an X and a Y. And so I'm more likely to think that Adam was probably a female. And then a man got in charge of the book and changed the words. So I just really love this topic, and I'm so excited to share. Thank you, Shrikant.
Well, thank you, Stephen. Next up is going to be Maritza, Paul S, and no, I think Paul has left. So it's going to be Maritza and William and Yanfei. Maritza, go ahead.
So I'm still in the early phases of reading the book, but I am reading the book and I'm in tandem with several of Peterson's lectures and such. And now I'm not certain if it's because I'm also rereading in tandem some objectivist texts, but I find I'm so excited to see parallels there. You know, in the book so far, you know, I'm seeing that what he's saying to us is that objective reality is something, there's nothing wrong with that or striving towards that, but without meaning, it's going to be a lesson in failure. I will say that I, as with all of Peterson's stories, that he tends to use a lot of mythology to show his point, but I always worry that readers or viewers of his works will get too caught up in the story. So I just want to take a minute and just remind folks who are going on this journey with us all together reading that it's not really about the actual story. There are so many myths that are similarly veined. His point is that it's a cycle, and the cycle is pervasive in so many aspects of our lives. And what he says, his words actually, you know, he says, you know, it's the paradise, the encounter with chaos, the fall, and then the redemption. And those are more important. Those aspects, those concepts are far more important than whichever story it is that is being depicted by them. So, you know, Roger and Victor and Claire did a fantastic job of giving us 3 very good examples, but it's just important to remember that these are just examples. The real takeaway here is that we internally, externally, and individually or as a community, we will in our life constantly go through these 4 phases. And I'm thinking and suspecting as I'm going along here, looking at this book, that Peterson is going to provide us with materials that will help us in our understanding of our cycles and hopefully those cycles of others in order to navigate our, you know, our path towards whichever it is for you, if it's enlightenment or improvement or knowledge with a little bit more presence of mind and information. Thanks.
Thank you, Marissa. Next up is William, Yanfei, and Anderson. William.
Yes, this is my second attempt at Maps of Meaning, and I want to thank Roger and Claire and Victor. Their explanation is excellent. And I think they cover the main points, which is something that I need. I think your tip on reading the summary and concentrating on that helps. And the 30-minute videos help too. Kind of where I'm at this second time around through the book, and something I think other people that may be having trouble with the book is just get what you can out of the book at this time. Because if you read it again next year, you'll get something else. But I'm just trying to get something new, something I can use, regardless of the level of my understanding. And that's it. Thank you.
Excellent point, William. Next up is Yanfei Anderson. Yanfei.
So I'm actually listening to the audiobook because as I shared with my breakout group earlier, I actually kind of enjoy listening to Jordan Peterson shout at me. And I think he does a great job enunciating, which really helps to drive the points home. So I got through the first chapter, but what struck me the most actually was the preface, the introduction, which I normally skip, but because I was listening to the audiobook, I ended up hearing it. And it was fascinating for me to hear from Jordan Peterson's own mouth, how his mind works. And it really struck me from listening to him that he actually, as a person, he personifies the very ideas that he is perpetually writing about. I think as a person, he literally is standing on the knife's edge between order and chaos. And I think it was fascinating that, we saw him slip into chaos only recently with his 9-day coma in Moscow, and now he's emerging out of it back into order. And I just think it's beautiful and inspirational to watch.
Excellent. Thank you, Yanfei. Next up is Anderson and Aaron. Anderson.
Yeah, thank you to the presenters. You did an amazing job in the presentation. It was incredible. I was very, if I can use the word, edified by it. And like I said before, I've listened to Peterson a lot. And sometimes I repeat the podcast and the lectures and the maps of meaning. He's got the series there and the Genesis series, which is amazing. That I believe that his insights sometimes are more profound than those of many theologians, I have to say, given that, I've been very passionate for Genesis too. And I have to confess that I started reading the book and I have to start again so that I can really take, the essence of it, the essential. It's not going in a rush. I have to go back and I love to highlight and if I don't understand a concept or if there's a story, an illustration, I go back and read it. I think George mentioned that. And that requires patience. It's not just to put another book in the shelf and move to the next. So, I love that Peterson shows very vulnerable. He's not afraid. I think in that sense, I believe he embraces chaos because he's not afraid of telling the world what he's going through. And that, I think that's reality, that's life, embracing and acknowledging our own demons and fighting them and going that path to order. So that's, that's amazing to me.
Wonderful. Thank you, Anderson. Next up is Aaron, Jeff, and Jeff G, and then Mike. Aaron, go ahead.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about in the great breakout room how all of these like mythological stories are connected. I kind of want to just give a little advice on reading philosophical texts. Like I read Maps of Meaning a few months ago, and I've read a lot of other philosophical type texts. And I'm actually, and people are going to hate me for this, I'm actually not a highlighter / post-it note kind of reader that just like makes sure that every little sentence must, no. When you're reading, what you're trying to do is you're trying to take the information and connect it to the broader schema of things that you already know. So when you find a sentence that you are not understanding, don't just sit there and highlight it 5 times and like Google search every single word and post a note every, like you're going to get frustrated and you're going to give up on the book and not get anything out of it. So when you're not understanding something in a book, especially a very dense philosophical text, what it means is that you don't have the pre-existing schema to actually understand what it is that page is trying to say. And I'm here to tell you that's okay. Keep on reading. And as you read more of these kind of books, your existing schema of knowledge is going to increase, and then you're going to be able to understand things with a greater deal of clarity and so forth. And, you know, again, I would just recommend plowing through the book. The very first philosophy, you know, that when I read Kant back in like college, I understood maybe 15% of it, you know, and it's like the reason that was the case is because I didn't have the existing schema to really take it all in at that particular moment. But the more you plow through these books, it's like a muscle, you're going to get a lot stronger at it. I hope that just helps for anyone, you know, wishing to give up or frustrated out there.
Okay, next up is Mike. Mike, are you there?
Yes, yes. Hi, thanks. I tied this very much to what Joseph Campbell wrote in his theory of myths, and Joseph Campbell was also a Jungian. Now, back in reading Joseph Campbell, I tied that back to the writings of Hobbes and Rousseau. The debate as to whether man is basically evil or man is basically good, and he needs. And Hobbes said he needs a set of rules in order to function as a civilization. And Rousseau said that it was basically man is good, and you should let his individuation function. Now, what I got out of this is you need a common story. But all of these people said you need a common story so that you can trust people that you never met, so you could build agriculture and not starve to death, and you could build walled cities and armies so you can not get enslaved by your neighbors, and that functions the us versus them, but also functions a kind of a populism, a nationalism that has been true since the Sumerians. The Sumerians had the myth of Gilgamesh, which we talked about today, Victor talked about. And the Judeo-Christian thing had essentially the Bible that provided that guidance. I was going to go into the two versions of creation in the Bible, but we covered that pretty well. I had one thing about that. The first one was the technical details of how God created light and separated it from darkness. And the second version essentially created the sociological structure and even the psychological structure of how to function. There's also Shakespeare and our Constitution.
Mike, let's
also
not
give
get
us a
too
story.
far. Let's not get too far.
Okay.
But excellent points.
So,
Excellent points. Always appreciate. I have to remember always to give you time limit. You function amazingly well when you have time limits, and you always have interesting things to say. Thank you, sir. Next up is going to be Joe, followed by Dave. Joe.
Yes, and I just want to thank Roger and Claire and Victor again. That was a fantastic presentation. It usually is, but this is really kicks it off well, and it really drove home some points for me. The idea, I'm reading the book, and the thing that really sticks out to me is that you can really see the 12 rules clearly right in the beginning. You know, you can see where his idea of even engaging with the prisoners as, you know, trying to find out this is, you know, and he had an urge to stab his classmate, that every one of us has evil within us. And actually, just coincidentally, Rule 6 had come out in our breakout room. But the idea, the other thing that I found to be really interesting is how he had these belief systems. And this was his way of bringing order to his life, and that he actually finished school without a belief system. And how tearing down those systems actually allowed him to go find what he found to be true. So that was a wonderfully written journey that I really appreciated quite a bit. The thing that I also liked, that I've also, you can come across in the beginning, is that his goal is to develop an understanding of himself as well as others. And that's a really noble task as far as I'm concerned, is that is really what life's all about. And I find the idea of understanding the, the unexplained or unexplored and explored, and these unknowns and unknown unknowns, known unknowns. And I find that to be really exciting on a number of levels, both from a psychological and both in a physical and scientific. And so I think that this is really going to complement a lot of things that I've been looking into anyway. One of the main things that I took away from the book this far is I really want to see how his personal journey away from systems influencing his beliefs, and in his journey in understanding himself. And that's what I kind of think we can extract from this. So that's all.
Thanks, Joe. So next up is going to be Dave. And then I think that is the list of people who have said that they have read the book. But if I missed anybody, just go ahead and type ! And then I'm going to just go alphabetically, and everybody can put their 2 cents in. Dave, you're next.
Thanks very much, Shrikant, and Roger, Claire, and Victor. A great presentation, a good explanation, and combined with the half-hour videos, I think is a good way to decode. I've been fighting my way through this book for about 3 or 4 months. I'm about halfway through. Thing is, I got these dang meetups that take up all my time. But the thing is, I can only usually read about 5 or 10 pages at a time, and I hit my limit. And I would second Aaron's comment that he uses a lot of big words, and usually you can tell by the context. But I would not say you're not going to speed read this thing. But sometimes I just ignore one word and just go on. And as Aaron says, the context is evident. And the other thing is, I would say Jordan Peterson has read everything, and it's talking about Solzhenitsyn and Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. It's just amazing, his insights and everything. But I'm glad we're making our way through this. I think it's going to be quite a voyage. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dave. We have an entire team of Davids here. Next one is David Miller, followed by David S. David, go ahead. David Miller, go ahead.
Hey, look, I'll just skip making a comment this time, Shrikant. Okay,
that's fine.
Thanks.
Next up is David S.
That was a bold move, David. Well, I'm trying to see this as a philosophy book. I see it more as an interpretation, so far as we've gotten, or an application of a certain psychological theory, for explaining things, sort of like self-help, in terms of you have to understand yourself as a psychological being, and why these myths have power, and what is it that how are they talking? So that's something that happened in our group, was discussing the way some religious people talk in their language. And it's almost a barrier, if you can't pierce that language. God language is a certain language. So it's good for us to subsume that kind of speaking, try it out, see what the powerful stories contain. And this skimming through them once is not going to give us the depth of someone who's steeped in those traditions, but it's good to see Peterson pulling them in and giving them some depth from his point of view. I think that's really a great thing to see. And like other things that are difficult to read, I agree with what maybe Aaron said or whatever, that yet it's not the words that matter. Sometimes it's a whole thought in a paragraph. So sometimes you read the paragraph as a thought, right? I mean, that's the way a lot of these writers are. The last thing was I'm waiting to hear, and probably it's going to be in a future part of this book because everything seems to come out at some point. But we didn't talk about growth as something which finding chaos, seeking chaos, looking for chaos. I mean, you're not going to grow if you're not actually confronting struggle. So I just certainly here it was like struggle will be brought to you. Do not worry. Well, I'm asking the other question, right? Okay, you know, if I'm getting a little comfortable, maybe I have to find struggle or whatever. Yeah, so there's just a question I have about going forward.
Absolutely, we're definitely going to get through that. The new book of Jordan Peterson is entirely about that. So that I'm really looking forward to that one. Next up is Jean, followed by Hugo and Jairo. If any of you want to skip, you can just go ahead and put skip. Jean, go ahead.
Yeah, I think someone asked about this. I was wondering, you know, is external chaos create internal chaos, or vice versa? Is internal chaos create external chaos? And actually, I have this revelation about, you know, pet is order and human is chaos. That's why human cares about pets so much, because they provide this emotional stableness that you don't find in human being. So also another interesting thing is, you know, I found there's always external chaos and they turned into internal order. So somebody in the group mentioned somebody lost a limb, which is huge chaos. But once they accepting it, it's no longer chaos. It become order. It's part of who he is. So we constantly transform the external chaos into internal order. And what Jordan Peterson trying to do, or all the philosophy we are trying to study on meta meaning, is trying to create this internal order system. So we can put everything in order. Even though we encounter something, we have no way where it belongs to them, we quickly categorize into the right location, or we create a new branch to make it into the order. So constantly building this system or a thinking process is help us to facing the external chaos, because we have orderness, internal orderness. Otherwise, the external chaos will turn into more chaos internal, which create more chaos externally. So I think that's kind of what I learned from this.
Excellent point, Jean. Really appreciate that. I think that was excellent. Next up is Jairo, followed by Jeff Nugent and Joanne. Jairo.
Thank you. Yes, one question that comes to mind is, I wonder how is Carl Jung interpreting the idea of the collective unconscious, and do these myths get embedded in everybody's unconscious through culture, through reading the Bible stories, or getting together and listening to them, or everyone reinterpreting them, and maybe well before the Bible was written down, it was like spoken for centuries and evolved, and so it was seeping into the unconscious, and then there's competing creation myths from different cultures, and even the one that was discovered in the Nag Hammadi discoveries, that's the Gnostic version of the creation, where it's the kind of the gods are backwards, like it's the serpent that's the good god, and it's the other one that puts him in the garden that is the bad god, and so and that makes sense to me, because it's bringing the humans to the knowledge of good and evil, and so that's kind of good. So that's kind of what we want, right? And so I'm thinking that maybe all these myths, there's a survival of the fittest myth happening, that we happen to get to the myths that we're learning here because they survived, and they won out over other myths. and we're stuck with them, and we're dealing with them, and maybe it's affecting the way we are.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jairo. I mean, we're going to be talking about this on Sunday. Jungian approach to kind of looking at kind of common myths across cultures and trying to get at something that is kind of common to human consciousness as a result of that. Next up is going to be, let me see, Joanne, followed by Julie and Kevin. Joanne. Sorry, Joanne, your sound is terrible. Joanne, your sound is terrible. Give me just a second. Sorry about that. Just a second. Joanne, your sound is terrible. Let me see if I can mute you. Just a second. I don't know. I'm having trouble muting. Give me a second. Let me see. What has happened to Joanne? Okay. All right. There is a delay. Sorry, Joanne. Next up is Jeff. Jeff, go ahead.
Hey, you all. Thanks for an amazing presentation. I just want to center in on two sentences that I believe were Roger and Claire. I think Roger, you may have said something like leaders are those who are willing to follow the person who will take on the chaos. And I think Claire, you were talking about folks who will cut up reality, sort of break it up and reframe it, reimagine it, and somehow fit it together in a new and better way. And I really think at this time, really across the world, as we consider how these concepts apply to societies as well as individuals, that we are looking for folks who will especially honorably take on the chaos and and embrace reality, but break it up and reframe it and reimagine some things and help us all to kind of wrestle some of this chaos to the ground in a way that works for all of us. So I want to thank you for that, and I think it's an intriguing concept.
Thank you, Jeff. Next up is Julie, followed by Kevin and Mushki. Julie.
Skip. I'll skip. Thanks.
Next up is Kevin, Mushki, and Paul.
Thank you, Shrink. Thank you for a presenter. Good job, you guys. Roger's chaos is source of everything. Order cannot exist without chaos. Chaos or order could coexist at the same time, inside or outside. One believe it, another is one believe it is order, another person could consider it chaos. So our challenge is to find a common ground. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Next up is Mushki, Paul, and Pegor.
Hi. Hi. So we discussed how it's important to embrace chaos and not force order by using distractions. And Peterson talks to keep 1 foot in chaos and 1 foot in order. So I'm wondering, is this supposed to be a 50-50 ratio? And also we mentioned the mother and the father. So the mother personifies chaos and the father personifies order, and the child is the mediator between the two. The thing is, child often leans one way, either to the mother or to the father, chaos or order. So I think it's natural for us. So I'm wondering, how do we keep 1 foot in order, one in chaos, 50-50?
Wonderful. So we're going to be looking at kind of multiple kinds of dances that are done on those 2 feet, between order and chaos throughout the book. So stay tuned. We'll have many different versions of it, and consequences of different. Yeah. Next up is going to be Pegor.
Hey, first of all, thank you to Roger, Claire, and Victor for the presentation. As always, grateful for that. I just want to say that especially given the times that we're living in, it's very important to remember that if we do not voluntarily update order at every level of reality, whether it's the psychological, the personal, the family, the community, or the state, eventually our order will collapse into chaos and a new system will emerge. And so it's upon us each individually to do that at every possible level so that we avoid the collapse and descent into chaos.
Thank you, Pegor. Great thoughts. Next up is Paul. Paul.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, everyone. Building a bit first on what I think Kevin said, and Jean, that someone might be in a constant mode of changing jobs every 2 years and changing relationships every 2 years. And to them, that's order. So it's just reinforced. So it would be chaos in their lives and introduce that giant disruption to marry someone and settle down and have a completely stable job for 10 years. That would be their chaos. So just reinforcing that point. And also, it's somewhat of a value judgment we put on when we decide what ratio we should, everyone should have, that I'm not sure I'm comfortable with. And I think in the political sphere, it would behoove everyone both to have compassion and understand how to change minds, to understand that someone might be attracted to a candidate or a leader because they conform and help them reinforce their ratio of order to chaos in their world. So rather than think they're crazy for clinging to some belief about whoever it is, I will name no names, or to understand what psychological need is being filled in this order chaos continuum by that person so that they cling to an allegiance even when there's a lot of facts against. Also relates to confirmation bias I had never thought of before, that the need for a certain order chaos mix creates confirmation bias. So those are my thoughts.
Wonderful. Thank you, Paul. So Victor, Roger, and Claire, can you talk a little bit about what you're going to do next? What's the next, what is coming up in a week?
I'm not gonna lie, I haven't watched the video yet, so I'm familiar with it, but I don't know what the next topic is yet.
That's fine.
I do have something I did want to touch on though, since it seems like a lot of people are struggling with this book, and it's something that now that I think of it, with Aaron kind of pointed out that, because I was a philosophy major, so I spent a lot of time reading philosophy, but once I was reading it, I'm like, yeah, there's a lot of words there that's the only reason I know that was because I've wasted a lot of time just reading a lot of different old texts. So here's the way I do it, and the best way I've been able to find several things. One, first and foremost, don't assume you're going to get it all. When this book was first made, I think he sold like less than 500 copies. It's a super dense academic book. It's not meant to be like 12 Rules for Life, which is meant for the general public. This is very much Peterson spending 15 years of his life to make a concrete case and to make a very strong point to academics and to put it to the highest critique that he can find. So you need to, one, approach it very differently than 12 Rules, whereas 12 Rules was much more meant to be general practical advice. This is him trying to make very strong arguments for what he's trying to propose. As far as how to process it, Shrikant's idea of reading the general summaries really helps, because then you know what he's aiming at, which helps. For me, I normally listen to the audiobook and read at the same time. And something I picked up from debating in college was I do highlight, but what I highlight is the part that most captures what the general paragraph is saying. And what that allows you to do, or parts that are vital for that point. And what that allows you to do is, if you don't understand it, then you just read the highlighted parts and see how they connect. And you're kind of constantly trying to see how all these random words connect and what it is that they're trying to point to. Writing an outline is also really helpful, but by far the thing that helped me the most, but it's also the thing that takes the most time, is watching the lectures online, watching his 2017 and 2015 lectures. It's a big lift, which is why we didn't require it for this. It's about each lecture is about 2.5 hours. They're split within 2 videos. So, but in that case, he gives a lot more examples. He's explaining and really walks you through his form of thinking, which can really help you wrap your head around what it is he's trying to get at, for those that are interested.
So, so on this, I have a few observations as well. See, the way I think about it is the terms I use is map and territory. Book is always a map. It's the territory that you're after. You're trying to see the issue that is operative in your life. And that's what really matters. Any book is just, and all the books put together are just trying to point to that. And you are trying to create your own map of the territory. Now, the great thing is that all of us are familiar with Jordan Peterson's work. And his work is quite consistent, actually. He's, so all the videos that you have watched, 12 Rules, all his commentaries on the Bible or his commentaries on different psychologists, all of them are actually about the same thing. And you have a lot of that already. So it's not, the book is not the only thing that is going to get you to the territory. So I definitely recommend this view of kind of thinking of yourself as a bird flying above the book and zooming in, diving in whenever you think you see something valuable, because you can do that on many things. You can do that for video. The other thing is that we have designed these series of meetups beautifully. Okay, firstly, Roger, Claire, and Victor are doing an amazing job of it, but see how many at different levels you're getting entry points to this. You have got the entry point of the book itself, which we all of us strongly recommend. You have the entry point of the videos, which are much shorter, much more kind of hard hitting, much more direct. Then you've got the entry point of the presentations. You got the entry point of the breakout room conversations. You got the entry point. Look at the takeaways. The takeaways today were just incredible. All of these amazing people. So pick up what you can. And all of these things are maps. And all of them are pointing to the territory. So you use them, kind of use like a combination of them to form your own map. I strongly recommend writing and drawing, because that's the way you actually understand things, not by reading. Reading, you read in order to write. You take in some information so you can, take all those ideas and actually figure out what you think about it. So writing, drawing is the way in which you can actually integrate things. And so those are my thoughts. So Victor and Claire, any thoughts about this book? Aren't these incredible people who are here? And just like the takeaways of people who have, especially people who have read the book. I mean, it just blew me away. So Victor or Claire, go ahead, Claire.
Yeah, no, I'm just so impressed, and it's always really lovely to see new faces here. I think we've grown to be sort of a family here. So keep coming, keep telling your friends, follow us on Twitter, go to the Reddit groups, really engage in this group. And we're all in it together in this book. It's killing me too, guys. Don't worry about it. We'll get through it.
Wonderful. Victor?
Yeah, it's an amazing experience here for me to listen and hear the same content from different people and to form it in an integrated way. That's amazing. And my suggestion would be to, as Roger was saying, watch his videos, if possible, multiple times. That would actually give a good fundamental for the stories and any content. And we come here, we dive deep into it. So that's my.
And okay, one kind of short thing, then I'm going to hand it over to Joe. If you really want to kind of get most out of this book and all the books you read How to Read a Book by Mortimer Adler. That's the best source of all the tips and tricks that you can use to access this entire world of 20 million books out there. Next up is Joe.
I just want to basically, and maybe Roger can actually comment on this. You definitely, I agree with you, Shrikant. You could see the themes in Peterson, all his talks coming together, and I can almost see that his new book, Beyond Order, where that is coming out of this as well. But Roger's lecture, Roger and Claire had given a presentation on Piaget's maps. And I think that if I remember correctly, and Roger can correct me if I'm wrong, you can kind of see where Jordan Peterson's concepts of writing maps of meaning are kind of derived from that particular graphic that you had up. I remember thinking that when I looked at that graphic, you could extract from that a lot of the concepts that he was talking about, even in 12 Rules. So that may be a worthwhile endeavor, is to go back and to look at that lecture. And I don't know what date that was, but it's on the website, obviously, as a way of maybe helping bringing a little bit more context to Jordan Peterson's Maps of Meaning book.
Wonderful. All right, folks. So on that note, it's almost 12 o'clock, and at 12 o'clock, chaos comes in and everything turns to pumpkins. So let's call it a good night, and we will see you folks soon. Good night.
Bye.
Bye.